Imagine the sky over Moscow glowing a deep, unnatural orange in the middle of the night. This was not a celebration or a city light show. It was the sound of a superpower losing its grip on its most vital resource. On June 12, 2026, the Kapotnya refinery did not just catch fire. It became the epicenter of a crisis that the Kremlin cannot fix with propaganda or empty threats. By the time the sun rose, analysts were already counting the cost. This was not a random hit. It was a surgical strike on the heart of Russia's domestic stability. Within hours, the realization began to sink in across the capital. Things were about to change. Most headlines you see are focusing on the massive explosions and the smoke plumes. But the fire is not the real story here. The real story is what is happening deep inside the machinery of that facility. There are components inside that refinery that Russia simply cannot build itself. They are the silent victims of a war that has finally come home to the pump. And the consequences are far more permanent than a temporary blaze. If you want to understand the grinding gears of modern conflict beyond the 30-second headlines, subscribe to Tower Kas, Nain, Tower Now. We go beyond the surface to show you how modern wars are actually won and lost. That is exactly what we do here every day. Kapotnya is not just another industrial site on the map. This facility supplies 40% of all the fuel used by the city of Moscow. It is the lifeblood of the most important city in the Federation. When Kapotnya stops, Moscow starts to slow down. The facility was designed to be a crown jewel of Russian energy independence. Now, it stands as a smoking reminder of a critical strategic vulnerability. Industry experts confirm the destruction of the ELOU AVT-6 primary processing unit. This is not a part you can simply order from a catalog or replace with a local substitute. This unit is the brain of the refinery. Russia believed their capital was a fortress protected by layers of advanced air defense. They thought the distance from the front lines provided a permanent safety net. That illusion was shattered in a single night of fire. There is no way the military leadership expected a strike this precise. They relied on the idea that internal infrastructure was untouchable. Now, they have to explain how the impossible happened twice in 1 week. On June 12th, and again on June 18th, the facility was struck with terrifying accuracy. These were not random drone swarms hoping to hit a building. These were targeted strikes designed to maximize long-term industrial paralysis. Each hit targeted the most specialized equipment on the grounds. The timing and the placement of the impacts suggest a deep understanding of the refinery's layout. It was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. The ELOU AVT-6 unit was built using high-precision technology from Western giants like Honeywell and ABB. Under current global sanctions, these companies are no longer providing parts or service. Russia is now locked out of its own technology. These distillation units cannot be recalibrated by local technicians without the original software and specialized tools. This is where the math of the war becomes brutal for the Kremlin. A few drones have caused years of damage. Replacing these units would take until at least early 2027 under perfect conditions, but conditions are far from perfect. The supply chain for specialized energy equipment has been completely severed. In a historic and humiliating reversal, the world's largest energy exporter is now an importer. Russia has been forced to begin emergency talks with Kazakhstan to secure 50,000 tons of AI-92 gasoline. The roles have flipped. They're also begging Belarus for fuel to keep their domestic market from collapsing entirely. This is a move of pure desperation for a nation that built its power on oil. The energy giant is now running on fumes. Fuel rationing has already spread like a wildfire across 53 different regions. In at least 15 of those areas, the authorities have taken the extreme step of banning gasoline sales in canisters. The panic is real. In Belgorod, Bryansk, and Kursk, the lines at the stations are growing longer every day. The government is trying to prevent hoarding, but the public can see the truth. The fuel they need to survive is being diverted to the front. While the public suffers, the reports reaching the Kremlin are being carefully filtered. Intelligence suggests General Gerasimov is downplaying the damage to avoid the wrath of the leadership. He calls it scheduled maintenance, but you cannot hide a frozen economy with a change in terminology. The disconnect between the reality at the pump and the reports in the office is widening. This internal friction is a mounting disaster of its own. The governor of Oral recently compared the current fuel hoarding to the pandemic-era food panics. When the civilian population starts to lose faith in the basic supply chain, the political foundation begins to crack. Morale is reaching a breaking point. But the fuel crisis is only one part of a much larger, more dangerous strategy. The destruction at Kapotnya was just the beginning of a campaign to dismantle Russia's sustainability. The target list is growing much longer. What happens when the military can no longer stabilize the very explosives they fire? The answer lies in a tiny, overlooked factory that handles something as simple as chalk. The stability of the entire front is now in question. To understand why the Russian military is beginning to fail, you have to look past the tanks and toward the molecular level. On June 22nd, 2026, the Voronezh semiconductor plant, known as VZPP-Mikron, was hit by a precision strike that changed the calculus of the air war. This facility is the sole provider of high-end microelectronics for Russia's most advanced weapons, including the Kh-101 cruise missile and the Pantsir S-1 defense system. Without these specific chips, the Russian military is no longer building precision instruments. They are building expensive, unguided lawnmowers. Most people see an explosion at a factory and think of the immediate fire. But the real story at VZPP-Mikron is what was happening inside the clean rooms. These environments require specialized Western calibration equipment from companies like Honeywell and ABB that are now strictly sanctioned. Because of the precision required for silicon wafers, even minor structural vibrations can ruin an entire production cycle. The strike on June 22nd didn't just break windows, it shattered the delicate infrastructure required to process Taiwanese silicon procured through shadow intermediaries. If you believe that understanding the industrial backbone of warfare is more important than watching 30-second clips, then you should subscribe to Nain right now. We look at the gears that actually turn the machine. Now, you might wonder why Russia cannot just buy more chips from their allies. The problem is that the Voronezh plant used a specific manufacturing process that was hard-coded into the designs of the Iskander-M missile systems. Changing a chip architecture isn't like swapping a battery. It requires redesigning the entire guidance motherboard, a process that can take years of testing that Russia simply does not have the luxury to perform. While the semiconductor plant was still smoldering, another strike hit on June 23rd that was even more confusing to outside observers. The target was the Melzavod Ege factory in Alekseyevka, a facility that produces high-grade chalk. On the surface, a chalk factory seems like a strange choice for a long-range drone mission. However, for those of us at Nain tracking the logistics of explosives, this was a masterstroke of asymmetric sabotage. This facility produces high-purity calcium carbonate. While you might know it as a common mineral, in the world of ballistics, it is a critical chemical stabilizer for solid rocket fuel and gunpowder. Without this stabilizer, the chemical compounds inside a missile or an artillery shell begin to degrade the moment they leave the factory. This creates a terrifying reality for the Russian soldiers currently handling this ammunition. When propellant becomes unstable, it doesn't just lose its range. It becomes prone to spontaneous combustion and accidental detonations during transport or while sitting in a storage depot. Imagine being a Russian truck driver knowing that the cargo behind you could explode because a factory hundreds of miles away stopped producing a simple white powder. This is the sustainability triangle in action: fuel, guidance, and stability. Ukraine is systematically removing the legs of that triangle. The math here is brutal and favors the attacker in every possible way. A single drone costing less than $10,000 has effectively neutralized a multi-billion-dollar propellant supply chain. Think about the scale of this loss. Russia can build as many T-90mm tanks as they want, but if the shells inside the turret are chemically unstable, that tank is a coffin waiting for a spark. The cost of the drone is negligible compared to the loss of a facility that cannot be rebuilt without Western cleanroom technology. We are witnessing the forced regression of a modern military back into the industrial age. This leads us to a second, more dangerous twist that most analysts are missing. The loss of these stabilizers means Russia's current ammunition stockpiles now have a definitive and very short expiration date. They cannot store these shells for years. They have to use them immediately or watch them become too dangerous to even move. This is creating a use it or lose it mentality that is driving desperate, poorly planned offensives. As the ammunition becomes more volatile, the Russian high command is being forced to pull their S-400 air defense systems away from the front lines. They are desperate to protect the few remaining oil and chemical assets deep inside the Russian interior. This creates a massive gap in radar coverage. By striking a chalk factory and a chip plant, Ukraine has indirectly blinded the Russian air defense network along hundreds of miles of the border. The psychological impact on the ground is already showing. Reports from the 47th Tank Division suggest that crews are refusing to load certain batches of ammunition because they have seen too many accidental turret tosses. This chemical crisis is intersecting with a growing fuel shortage that is paralyzing the entire southern front. The T-72B3M tanks are being delivered to the front lines, but they are arriving at dry depots. When a 50-ton tank has no fuel, it is no longer a weapon of maneuver. It is just a very expensive stationary target for an FPV drone. This is forcing a radical change in how Russia fights. Instead of the armored breakthroughs we saw in the early stages of the war, the Russian doctrine has devolved into something far more primitive. They are shifting toward infantry-heavy meat assaults because they can no longer rely on their machines. The logistics have become so broken that soldiers in the Lyman direction are now being ordered to carry heavy artillery rounds by hand over several kilometers. The trucks simply don't have the fuel to reach the zero line. While General Gerasimov continues to tell the Kremlin that everything is under control, The reality on the R280 highway tells a different story. This vital artery is becoming a graveyard for the Russian dream of a land bridge to Crimea. The disconnect between the sanitized reports in Moscow and the chemical reality of the front is widening every day. Russia is running out of time, chips, and the very chemicals that keep their war machine from exploding from within. The real question is no longer about who has more tanks. It is about how much longer a modern army can function when it loses its ability to produce a simple chemical stabilizer. The chemical instability we just discussed is currently dictating the flow of blood across the Lyman and Pokrovsk directions. We are seeing a fundamental regression in Russian military doctrine that borders on the medieval. The once feared armored maneuvers that characterized the early war have almost entirely vanished. In their place, the Kremlin has substituted something far more primitive and far more lethal for their own men. This is the era of the infantry heavy meat assault. Reports coming from the front lines of the 47th Tank Division paint a desperate picture of modern warfare. Despite having advanced tanks like the T-90M and the T-72B3M, these machines are essentially becoming stationary pillboxes. They are delivered to the front in pristine condition, only to sit idle in dry fuel depots. Without gasoline, these $100 million assets are nothing more than easy targets for Ukrainian FPV drones. The logistical failure is so complete that soldiers are now performing manual portage of heavy equipment. Russian troops frequently carry heavy artillery ammunition between 5 and 7 kilometers on foot. They do this because their transport trucks simply do not have the fuel to reach the zero line. This lack of mobility is reflected in the staggering casualty rates we are witnessing this month. For 22 consecutive days in June, Russia sustained daily losses exceeding 1,000 soldiers. Total estimated casualties for the Russian military have now reached a grim milestone of 1.4 million. While the human cost mounts, the primary military artery in the south is also being severed. Russia invested $11.8 billion into the R280 highway, known as the Novorossiya corridor. It was designed to be a permanent land bridge from Rostov-on-Don to Crimea, but that investment is now turning into a lethal bottleneck for the Russian southern group of forces. The Ukrainian 412th Unmanned Systems Brigade, known as Nemesis, has established 24-hour drone dominance over the road. As a result, military cargo traffic along this critical highway has dropped by an estimated 71%. With the Kerch Bridge closed to heavy traffic, the 600,000 Russian soldiers in the south are trapped. They are effectively stranded in a logistics bubble that is shrinking every single day. This brings us to what analysts are calling the Putin problem. There is a widening and dangerous disconnect between the reality on the ground and the reports reaching the Kremlin. Intelligence suggests that General Gerasimov is actively sanitizing reports intended for Putin. Catastrophic damage to critical oil refineries is being described to the leadership as simple scheduled maintenance. But the civilian population in the border regions can see through the official narrative. Fuel rationing has already spread to 53 separate Russian regions. In 15 areas, including Belgorod and Kursk, authorities have been forced to ban the sale of gasoline in canisters. This has triggered what local officials are calling a buckwheat panic, referencing the food shortages of the pandemic. When people see jet fuel prices surge by 52%, they know the war is no longer something happening far away. To protect what remains, the General Staff is making a desperate tactical trade-off. They are pulling S-400 air defense systems away from the front lines. These systems are being redeployed deep inside Russia to protect the remaining oil refineries from further drone strikes. This leaves the troops on the front even more vulnerable to Ukrainian air superiority. It is a vicious cycle where protecting the fuel supply costs the lives of the soldiers who need it. The economic math of this campaign is becoming impossible for Moscow to balance. One $8,000 Ukrainian drone can destroy a distillation unit that costs millions and takes years to build. Because of Western sanctions, repairing specialized units from companies like Honeywell is currently impossible. Russia is now in the humiliating position of importing gasoline from Belarus to keep its economy moving. They are even in emergency talks with Kazakhstan for 50,000 tons of AI-92 gasoline. However, the domino effect has already reached Kazakhstan as their own Tenneco raw material sources were struck. The sustainability triangle of fuel, guidance systems, and ammunition stability is effectively broken. The real question is not whether Ukraine can continue these strikes into the winter. The real question is how much of the Russian military will be left once the fuel finally runs dry. If you were in charge of the Russian General Staff, would you prioritize protecting the refineries or the front line? Tell us your strategy in the comments because we read every single one. If you want to understand the mechanics of modern warfare beyond the headlines, join our community by subscribing to Nain. We provide the deep dive analysis you won't find on the evening news. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next briefing.